Thank you for tuning in to the Savage Worlds GM podcast. I'm your host, Jared Savage Daddy Gunning. Tonight's topic is going to be homebrews. But before we get to that, tonight's episode is sponsored by Roll20.net, the world's largest virtual tabletop. Check them out today at Roll20.net. Follow us on social media. We're on Facebook and Twitter, SWGM Podcast. Check out the YouTube channel, like, subscribe, share. We're currently closing in on 1,000 subscribers. So we're at 975. So subscribe. And that's at youtube.com/Savage Worlds GM Podcast. Support us on Patreon. Become a member and producer of the show. The Patreon/Savage Worlds GM Podcast. So tonight, here to discuss the topic with us, Dave, the Rules Maven Scott.
Homebrew. Nothing tastes better.
And some call him Jib.
I don't want to know what you put in that brew.
Roofies. Definitely roofies. So we kind of want to talk to, I mean, Savage Worlds, one of the nice things about Savage Worlds being a generic or genre-less system, it just gives you a rule set that you can apply pretty much to any genre. And I know that I'm getting the sense, starting to get the sense we're seeing some community posts here and there about creating your own setting for Savage Worlds. You want to run your own campaign in your own world in Savage Worlds. I'm starting to get the sense that some of the rifters that have come in have kind of burned through the pre-printed content and are like, no way, maybe we can do some interesting stuff with this game.
The Rifts setting wasn't out, I don't think, more than like a week and a half, 2 weeks. And people were already like demanding conversion rules for how to take old stuff from the old Rifts and bring it up to be played with this. And there was a whole big shebang of community and forums where they really kind of hammered out how to do that. It would not surprise me at all if all those people who racked their brain with how to do that are suddenly starting to go, well, wait a minute, maybe I can do Turtles in Time or, you know, the Firefly or whatever with this system too. And I think it's fun to watch someone have that awakening to it being a truly settingless, genre-less system where you can do anything. Because I think that's what we all love about Savage Worlds the most, that have been playing it for, over a decade. And we kind of take for granted that everyone just understands that about this system.
Right. Yeah, I think also, too, that maybe, and with the gap in between Rifts and the Flash Gordon, I think there's some open space here to have a conversation about, hey, how do you do a homebrew in Savage Worlds? How do you do something that's not a pre-published setting? How do you don't want to say convert, because that's really a misnomer with Savage Worlds. You don't convert anything. You adapt it to Savage Worlds. So we kind of want to have that discussion a little bit. How do you philosophically approach that? Also, too, I did forget to mention earlier, now I'll go ahead and mention it real quick. If you're watching the live stream, you want to participate in the show, ask questions, offer advice, feel free to do so. Just type in the chat. We will be watching it throughout the show and incorporate it. So what are the things that we're going to caution? I think we're going to end up cautioning you on with doing any kind of a homebrew in Savage Worlds is your approach. The first thing you need to do is you have to have a decent understanding of the nuts and bolts, at least some experience playing the game or running the game before you necessarily jump in feet first into that deep end of the pool. You can be a good swimmer. You can figure it out, but you're going to have a much easier go at it if you've run or played in, I would say, at least 10 or 15 games. Not a requirement, more of a suggestion.
We talk about this quite often where we say, play it rules as written for a while, get a feel for it. And I think that that's a big aspect of what it takes to successfully do a house rule, but equally doing a homebrew requires that you be able to do the same thing, to be able to look at the mechanics and go, well, you know, a dramatic task does this, but I really need it to do that, so how do I twist it? Or the social conflict is a great mechanic, but how do I use social conflict for handling a starfighter battle? You know, there's a lot of things you can look at that the mechanics can be twisted, turned on their heads, etc., but you have to have used that mechanic enough to be familiar with it before you can know how to twist it on its head, especially when the key to a homebrew is there's a specific thing you're looking for. That flavor, that genre, that thing you're wanting to achieve is very specific. And now you're trying to make the Savage Worlds rules all work toward that thing. And you have to know them very well to get them to do that very easily.
Right. Because and the other thing too is complexity is the enemy when it comes to Savage Worlds. It really is. Don't sit down and create 25 new edges without first looking at the book and going, well, okay. Oh, I'm going to create an edge, and I've got this great name for it. I'm going to put a lot of flavor on it, and it's going to give you +1 toughness. Yeah, there's already an edge that does that. You don't need to do that. That's what we're talking about with having some experience with the game. You should understand for example, what the impact is of Born a Hero. Just the setting rules that already exist in Savage Worlds can help you take your homebrew and have it go to 11.
Not to talk about our games too much in this, but we just recently wrapped up the Mafia game where we used the trauma damage setting rule that I had created, and it was, you know, for all intents and purposes, for those who haven't actually got to play that, is take gritty damage right out of core rules, and the player characters never suffer wound penalties to anything except for the soak roll in order to soak wounds. So they take the wound, and when they go to make their soak roll, they have to use that wound penalty immediately. But thereafter, the only thing they suffer is that injury that they rolled on the injury chart. So the only tweak I made, a very small change. And every single player in that game was so dramatically shocked at the impact that had on the game and the way that changed the flow of combat, that all of them were taken aback by it, when in reality, if they had ever played just gritty damage out of the core rules, it shouldn't have been that much of a shock because it's not overly different. In fact, if anything, the version that we were using was less punishing than the version that's in core rules. I took gritty damage and made it a little less nasty, and yet people were like, whoa, what the hell is this?
Yep.
So just being familiar enough with that setting rule, the impact it has on the game, allows you to dial that in. That's why I was able to tweak that, and I wanted something that gave that grittiness, that raw feeling to the combat, but I didn't want it to be quite as punishing where it puts them into an immediate death spiral. But you definitely have that sudden impact of, oh, now I'm making a roll in the injury chart and I busted an arm, or I lost an eye, and those things had a massive impact on the game.
Right. And well, the other thing too is you don't need, here's the other thing that you should try to avoid too. Don't try to just start putting a bunch of stuff into that funnel. And by that, I mean, you don't need to sit down and create new skills. Well, Savage Worlds doesn't have a crafting skill. Well, right. Because, well, it kind of does. It's called repair. Savage Worlds doesn't have this skill or doesn't have that skill. You want to be very careful about altering or adding to the skill list. Now, I say that to say this, in a modern setting where people don't ride horses, but ride bicycles or skateboards, things like that, you could just clarify that riding applies to anything that requires balance. Anything that requires balance. So a vehicle, like a motorcycle, a bike, skateboard, skates, paragliding, you could call that piloting, I guess. But the idea is making very specific. tweaks to the rules that are already there, the skills that are already there. A lot of skill specialization comes in the form of characters picking specific knowledge focus roles. So you might want to define what there's no way you can sit down and create an entire list of every knowledge skill ever in the game of your homebrew, and there's no need to. But identify the very specific ones, like demolitions allows you to create, diffuse, and set off bombs. It has this effect, it has that effect. Be very specific about the skills that you're looking for when you're doing that.
And I would say when you're looking at something like knowledge skills, make sure you differentiate between an active skill that the players are using and the knowledge of a topic. You know, they might roll knowledge to create the bomb or to, you know, detonate it using the remote timer, etc. But they might also have to then make a repair roll to attach the bomb to the car or to place it in the right spot on the ship to do the most damage, or whatever the case may be, so that your new rules don't obfuscate or replace the core way Savage Worlds works. One thing that Clint has talked about extensively was the idea that one of the reasons there's not a quote-unquote knock spell, a knock power that allows the wizard to booty booty boo and unlock a door is because it tramples all over the thief edge and the entire archetype of the thief character. And that's why it's easier to do so the wizard takes lock picking, makes a roll, but their tools are the arcane. You don't want to take away the viability of something else in the system with that new thing you've added. It's great to add to it, but don't go so overarching that you end up overshadowing the existing core the way Savage Worlds works.
Right. And put a finer point on what Dave was saying about knowledge rules. There's nothing wrong with taking something that already exists in the game and applying it in a new way. So, for example, one of the big things in Savage Worlds is the cooperative role. If more than one player character has the same skill, they can make a cooperative roll that adds a +1 for every success and raise to the leader's roll when they make that roll as a way of helping them. You could apply the same philosophy to knowledge rolls. Let's say, for example, you've got a surgeon, somebody with the healing skill, and they have knowledge anatomy. You could always call for a knowledge anatomy roll as a cooperative roll to the healing roll they're about to make. And say, well, you size it up. You're trying to figure out anatomy. You have to visualize where the pancreas is before you slice into the abdomen. Give me a knowledge roll, and every success is going to add a +1 to your healing roll.
It's either in the core rules or it's in the superpowers companion where they talk about skill synergies, where if it's going to slow the game down too much to do that kind of self-cooperative roll to roll anatomy before rolling healing, instead just give them a blanket +1 or +2 for having that other trained skill.
Right.
It's real simple. You just go, oh, you're also trained in X, therefore you get a +1 on this roll. I'm not going to make you make 2 rolls in a row because it would just slow the game down too much.
Right. And if the knowledge skill is very, very much a core fabric of your game, it's something that's very important. Like, let's say you're running a sci-fi game and computers become incredibly important. You assume that everybody has common knowledge, knows how to run a computer. You don't require computer rolls. However, if you're going to hack something, now that's where it comes into play. Yeah. So it's also about the application of it as well.
Well, and we've talked about before, like if you're running a modern game, it's common knowledge to drive a car from one side of town to the other. You know, first of all, it's narrative. Second of all, if there is a minor bumps and bruises type challenge, it's going to be a common knowledge roll. It's only when, oh wait, now we're in a chase. Okay, now I actually want you to give me driving rolls. Right. You're not using the skill to do everything. The knowledge skills are there to pad out some of that. And being able to say, well, in this particular setting, knowledge chemistry might be a form of magic in a medieval setting, whereas in a modern setting, my knowledge chemistry just means you were a high school student.
Right. Let's real quick take the question from Ruben.
Okay, so Ruben asks, for the podcast, which is one setting or idea you might have thought of homebrewing? TV, movie, literature, etc.
Well, for me, it's anybody who's listened to the podcast for a long time knows for me that's Walking Dead, but much, much grittier.
There's been a couple. We just recently played through a slightly twisted version of what I would call my Godfather setting. I wanted to go more 1920s and 30s time period with it when I was first writing it up, but the group kind of chose 60s and 70s that fit their mold a little bit better. I've also written up a superheroes meet fantasy thing that we've played through before that was pretty interesting. But I think if I had to pick one out there that I haven't done, if I had to pick something that no one else has done as far as I know, there was a book, and I'm trying to think of what it was named now, where it was this amalgamation of different races are all put into the army as kind of as their prison sentence. And the leader of it was this rich guy's son who gets in a lot of trouble, and he ends up over top of it. And I, for the life of me, can't think of the name of the book. But you've got these amorphous slugs that ride around on hoverboards, and you've got these 6-armed people who are very, very demure, and they're giant freaking hairy beasts that never attack anyone. And you got one of them is the chef for the platoon and things like that. It's a very interesting setting in that it goes I almost want to say Slipstream route of everything you throw at the wall sticks for a new race. You could literally, take any 3 things out of the racial book, jam them together, and now you have a race. And it allows you to have that true intergalactic feel. And I think that would be a great setting to play with.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Killer Crew 80s rocker. What's the
Savage
Iron Maiden?
Zunram, I think is how you pronounce the name, said Savage Iron Maiden. Based on the themes of the British band Iron Maiden, the heroes are roadies, the killer 80s rockers. Secretly, they fight supernatural creatures in a heavy metal style. So this immediately makes me think of Kiss versus type stuff out of the 70s, but updated to the 1980s, the heavy metal magazine and heavy metal movie style.
Metalocampus, isn't that?
Along those lines. And the idea of a traveling band, and then it's the characters have their day job as the roadies and their the night job as vigilante superheroes fighting back ghosts and goblins. Seems interesting to me, but I would almost want to go a little bigger, a little broader than that. But
yeah, maybe put an intergalactic spin on it, maybe a sci-fi spin. I think probably one of the things that you could very easily convert, which we talked about before as a homebrew, is Firefly. Firefly is super easy to run in Savage Worlds without changing hardly anything. I would also say probably Starship Troopers, now that I think about it.
Starship Troopers is amazing, but the thing there is, I would say go with the movie version and not the book.
Right.
I go with the movie version. Very politically driven, whereas the movie is far more action-packed, which I think just it really fits Savage Worlds better. But in chat, Mel Primus brings up that he's currently running a Fallout game in Savage Worlds. And I've seen a couple different people who've said that they ran a Fallout game. And it does fairly well. And I think that, again, speaks back to the core rules can do just about anything. Right. And the whole thing that we're talking about here is how do you then twist it to do X or Y? And I think the how leads into this next question very well. And it's from Sunset Sam. What's the homebrew you were excited about and you thought would work, but just fell flat when it was actually run? And why did it fall flat? Would you like to jump on the grenade first?
No, go ahead. Toss the grenade at my feet if I think it's what you're thinking of.
Well, before I throw you under the bus, because I know exactly the perfect one for you, I will say this. I ran Star Wars now 3 separate times. Every single time that I've run it, it falls flat on its face. Whether it's you get the player character who suddenly starts narrating everything as if they were playing one of the Star Wars video games, where they're the central hero to the whole story instead of letting the rest of the party have their moment. Or you get the player characters arguing, well, you can't do that because in blah, 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 so-and-so did blah, 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 with the blah, 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 blah. And because of that, you can't do that thing here because it's against canon. And then the last one that I ran fell completely on its face as soon as a player character walked over to the dead body of the stormtrooper and searched through its pockets trying to look for intergalactic credits. And that's when I hung it up on the shelf. It doesn't matter how well I know Savage Worlds. It doesn't matter how much Savage Worlds can do Star Wars. Players are going to have a play style or are going to be so married to a large IP like that unfortunately I think it's got too many landmines built in. Whether it's the arguing over what's canon and what's not, or whether a Wookiee should have a D8 or a D10 strength by default, or I think there's too many little things out there that all compound among the Star Wars fans that it's just, wow, go play any other sci-fi than that and let them have laser swords in the Force, but don't play Star Wars. Because as soon as you go playing Star Wars, everybody has that preconceived notion they bring in. So for you, on the other hand, I think there's a certain, shall we say, cattle punk.
Yeah. Well, I'll say this. I overthunk it. With being the problem. We for a little while, we tried a homebrew version of the Wild Wild West TV show, essentially. And it was one of the first homebrews I really put together, really tried to put together in a lot of detail. And what I ended up doing was pulling from way too many sources. It became unmanageable and completely untenable because I did that. So there's how many edges from how many different books? What? Hold on. We're okay. And to the point where one of my characters was, and I say it was easily able to do this. It wasn't a struggle. It didn't come out of left field. And when it happened, it was not a surprise. But it was the point where I went, all right, here's where it fell flat. I got to fucking hang this up. I'm done. One of the characters basically had the martial arts, arcane background from Deadlands, essentially. And in this game, karate chopped his hand through a locomotive steam engine without spending a damn penny. No pennies spent, just standard roll. And at that point, I went, all right, I can't challenge these players. It's just if a guy could walk up, if a seasoned or novice character can walk up and karate chop a train, I'm done. There's nothing I'm gonna be able to throw at them that is gonna make sense as a challenge.
With that said, I do just want to say, if you're out there listening, I love you, Pat. You really need to come back for the Friday night game.
And if you want to see those antics, I've recently opened that back up on the YouTube channel. There's a playlist for Wild Wild West. I think there's only like maybe 4 videos. Very short-lived
game. the dynamite mechanics and the dancer
specialized chase cards. I borrowed from too many sources. Here's the problem. Savage, and this I think is probably a good lead into what we should talk about next. Savage Worlds works best when you don't add too much to it or hardly anything to it. It's when you tweak it in just the right, turn the knob just the right way to get that flavor.
We've used the idea of a stew before. I think it actually comes a lot closer to bechamel, which is that rich, creamy stage right before you make gravy, where you're going to add in the spices to go to gravy, or you're going to add in the cheese to go to cheese sauce, or you're going to add in this or that. You can add in a whole lot of different stuff to bechamel to make different sauces. But you don't want to add sausage and cheese, because then you end up with cheese gravy. No, you can absolutely, as soon as you start sprinkling too much of the pot, ruin what you're making. And I think that's what the cattle punk thing unfortunately ended up suffering from. And it was twofold, and I think it really highlights two of the biggest mistakes that you can make when you're doing a homebrew. And the first is, when you have too much in there, sooner or later something conflicts. Sooner or later, this rule does X, but this rule does Y, and now you've got a scenario where those two things are happening at the same time. And it runs in conflict. It just makes it really, really difficult as a GM to arbitrate. The secondary issue is, once you get to a certain point, no one at the table knows the rules. And right. You end up in the D&D world where now we're pulling out a reference document in the middle of the game to look something up. You've lost the elegance that is built into Savage Worlds, and right there the game falls apart.
Well, let's talk Deadlands for a second, because Deadlands is a great example of homebrewing something. It's very, very much, it's Weird West. It's, this takes place in the classic old, it's a Western. It's set in a Western genre, but we got elements of steampunk and horror mixed in that stew. Now, here's the thing. Savage Worlds will handle a Western just by you saying this is a Western.
Yep.
You don't need to do anything to run a Western in Savage Worlds. Just pick up the core rules and go. You're done.
Rename, auto fire, fan the hammer.
Yep. Steampunk is a weird science implementation. If you're running any kind of steampunk anything, it's a weird science implementation. There's quick draw. All the rules already work perfectly for it. You don't need to change a thing. Now, here's the thing with Deadlands. What Deadlands does is, and this is a good example, is it takes that Western thing and go, okay, let's throw in some unique rules for gun duels, because we want to make sure we get that spaghetti Western, two guys facing off in the middle of the street kind of flavor into the game. And maybe we can add a special rule that does that. And they've got it. They want to make some very specific rules about reloads and how reloads work in an old West setting, because there's no clips, there's no magazines. So let's talk about that. Maybe we want to talk about hanging. How does hanging work? And here's the thing: even those rules that they're adding that are specializing that setting and adding those motifs and flavor are still based on existing mechanics and core rules, slightly modified. Mm-hmm. Basically, hanging is essentially the drowning rule or drowning hazard. If you really break it down and look at it, is essentially what it is.
It can be so much more brutal than drowning can be.
It can. It absolutely can. And then they've got, for the weird elements of it, they said, this is a world of horror, so we're going to play with the horror side and say, hey, certain levels have very, very high fear factors. You go into one area in Arizona, and oh my God, it is spooky. It is hell opened on earth. So all the fear rolls you make, you're suffering additional modifiers, negative penalties while you're here, because it's terrifying. So Deadlands is a good example of Savage Worlds core rules with just the right amount of flavor speckled into them.
Mm-hmm. And they do something that's very interesting. They get rid of all the existing arcane backgrounds and replace them wholesale.
Yep.
You can't play miracles, magic, psionics, any of that in Deadlands, but you can absolutely play the Blast or the Mad Scientist. And they are written to be different, but
similar.
See the roots of the power system still works the same way. You still get X number of power points. You still get, you still have X number of powers that you get. You still take the new power edges to get a power. They don't shatter that system to make something completely different. They just tweak it.
Right. So if you're used to playing core rules, for example, the reason that works so well is if you're used to playing core Savage Worlds, you've played any other Savage Worlds game. When you come over to Deadlands, oh, this feels familiar. It's just slightly different. How? Oh, okay. I grok that. I understand it works a little bit differently, but okay, it makes sense. And it also makes each one of those unique arcane characters specialized and different.
And having mentioned that, I want to roll into the El Cheapo gear from Deadlands. Takes an idea out of the powers system, adds it to the gear system, and calls it cheap gear. And that is the idea of backlash. This idea that when you roll a 1 on the skill die, something nasty happens, translates into when you roll a 1 on the skill die with El Cheapo gear, it breaks in your hand and is unuseful. That is such an elegant way of taking a mechanic, repurposing it, repackaging it, and slapping it in a different part of the system that makes a huge difference, fits the elegant motif of the Wild West, and, you've got the gun that was hanging up in the saloon that fell to the ground in the last duel where the guy never even cleared the holster, has been strapped around your waist when you challenged the gunslinger or marched out into the middle of town. So you have the El Cheapo gun to face off against the gunslinger. It fits perfect in that world, but it's just a retweak of something that already existed in Savage Worlds.
Right. And the dueling mechanic is basically a really quick hand of poker to see who fires first. I mean, if you really break it down, it's like, and the thing is that the use of the card mechanic in the duel is putting you in it helps reinforce the fact that you're in a Western, because poker was really big. It's a big part of the Western genre as far as a flavor. So of course you're going to use cards to do the duel mechanic. How would you do it any other way? Of course you're going to, because it reinforces. Even the gambling rules in Deadlands are slightly more specific because they want you to get that feeling of actually playing a game of poker in a saloon versus just, we're gambling in any other game. Just make a couple rolls, make a roll, done.
With Flash Gordon right around the corner, and we've already mentioned Slipstream once before. I think another great example of this is Slipstream's character creation, where race creation is just rolled right into race selection. It's not a separate system for the GM to go through prior to gameplay. Race creation is just presented to the player as part of creating their character when they get to the race at some point, and go through these race creation rules, create your own race, and bam, you're done. That is such an elegant reuse of something that already existed in core. You're just giving players permission to use it, when most of us look at that part of the book and go, oh, well, that's for the GM, and skip over it.
Right.
We go down to the pre-printed races, or we go to the races that have been presented to us by the GM. This just ostensibly says, no, create your race. And then it gives you like 80.
Oh, yeah, it's insane. Yeah, it's insane.
It's like, here's the core 12 that are presented the way they are in like the core rules, and then there's like 2 pages of little stat blocks for other races they've created, so that the player really is given a large plethora to choose from, and a large canvas as kind of a template to work from if they want to tweak something here or there.
Well,
reuse of another mechanic in a place that, all you have to do is think, well, wait a minute. You're going to play this intergalactic game where there's all these different races. Well, how do I handle making sure that none of the player characters come out exactly the same? Oh, I know. Here's 80 races and the tools to make your own during character creation.
Right. And let's talk, too, what Slipstream does as well. We're talking about adapting, doing homebrew. The idea of the setting is it's the Flash Gordon serial. Rocket ships, bubble helmets, and ray guns. And the evil Emperor Mongo mad scientist and Hawkmen and whatever. The thing that Slipstream does well too is it identifies, well, wait, what are the main tropes of this? Well, bad special effects are one of the main tropes of the cliffhanger. If you really kind of look at it, it's like no real scientific verisimilitude involved. When you fall and you're in space in a Flash Gordon serial, when you fall off the ship, you fall down as if there were gravity in space. The space is not a vacuum. It's just a very thin atmosphere. You can hold your breath and swim through space. As long as you have a bubble helmet on, you're fine. What? I got a bubble helmet on. Yeah, but you're got a bubble helmet on and a loincloth. Yeah, and it doesn't care about that. And those are key aspects of that genre. Those are very key tropes of that genre. So what Slipstream does a great job of doing is stating specifically, hey, space isn't a vacuum, and player characters can exist in space, but if they don't have the helmet on, just apply the drowning rules or the swimming rules when they're in space. Oh, and when they fall at like 1/3 the rate of gravity in the proper direction. It just says when you apply the rules, keep this in mind. It's not necessarily even a specific setting rule, really. Well, it kind of is because it changes. Let's define what a setting rule. A setting rule in Savage Worlds is something that takes the existing core rule and changes it.
Yep.
So it's not a homebrew rule. It's not something you're creating out of whole cloth. It's something you're saying, hey, guess what? We're playing more gritty style, so characters can't soak damage. There, done. You cannot soak damage. There, have a good night.
Well, and I think the big thing to keep in mind, the difference between a homebrew and a house rule. A house rule is we're playing Slipstream, but I don't like X from Slipstream. I'm house ruling it to work the way it does in core, or I'm house ruling it to work this other way. One of the most famous ones we talk about here on the show quite a bit is our house rule regarding fear. You don't roll on the fear table to see your character's reaction. You're automatically shaken because you were terrified or caused to have a fear reaction, and then it's up to you to how you want to role play your character. That way, we give that agency to the player to control how their character acts in any given situation. That's a house rule. That's not a homebrew. That is 100% a house rule where we've said it doesn't matter if we're playing ETU or Deadlands. We don't like the fear table aspect of the rule. Here's how we've changed it. A homebrew is, okay, I'm building Fey Run. What rules do I need so that Fey Run operates the way Fey Run would operate? And being able to create that. It's not a house rule at that point. It's a homebrew. You've got a very specific theme you're trying to achieve. It's not about what you like or dislike in the rules. It's about what's necessary for that. If I'm trying to do a Western, I need spaghetti Western tropes. I need gunfights. I need duels. I need horses that can be, a sidekick. You need very specific things that become setting rules. If I'm playing ETU, I need a rule that says no one can have an arcane background, but there is this ritual magic that people can do later on because that's part of that setting. It's part of that world. Magic is this thing a group of people do. It's not something that like a wizard or a witch stands there and casts fireballs. So you aren't house ruling the power system. You're homebrewing to make sure you get exactly that exact fit for your theme. And I think that's something that it gets argued a lot. It's my game. I should be able to run it the way I want. I understand that. But when you cross that line from I'm running my game for my players into I'm doing a homebrew, at that point, you got to make a consistent world. Why does that setting rule work in that world is far more important than I don't like dramatic tasks and therefore I'm removing them from the game.
Right. Absolutely. And just completely lost my train of thought.
Well, you...
the other thing too is not only changing a rule, it's prohibiting certain edges and hindrances because the effects they have on the game don't fit. They just don't fit. Like Dave was saying, like, nope, nobody can take any arcane backgrounds because there is no magic. Well, maybe with one exception, weird science. Maybe we allow weird science as high tech in that setting. Maybe we allow it, maybe we don't. But the point is, you may want to say, let's say you're running a post-apocalyptic setting, and that's a very broad genre for post-apocalyptic. But one of the themes is don't trust strangers. You can't trust strangers. They're only out to rob you or take so blah, blah, blah. And you may say that, hey, nobody can take the outsider hindrance because everybody in the game has it. Because when you first meet somebody, they're the -2 charisma, and you treat them like the person in the outsider hindrance until they prove themselves to you. So that makes sense for an apocalyptic game. You're playing Mad Max, you're playing Fallout, you're playing anything where you're dealing with a post-apocalypse and you can't trust other people.
Whereas at the other end of the spectrum, you might have a game where you don't allow the one arm, one leg, or one eye hindrance or lame because medical science is so advanced in your sci-fi world, or magic is so prevalent in your fantasy world, where an arm being cut off is literally a rush them to the hospital and it's taken care of. To run him to the temple and blah, 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 and bam, he's got an arm again. You can look at the thing not just in a, well, what doesn't fit because the genre has a trope that it goes against, but what doesn't fit simply because, well, how do you end up with one eye in a world where everyone can have their eyes immediately replaced with cybernetics, or, that it's automatic that they're going to take you to a temple and that the doctor is going to, heal you or pray over you or whatever the case may be.
Right.
In that world, it makes no sense. But by the same token, in that world, a doubting Thomas might be something that is treated like the outsider because you don't believe in magic or you don't believe in science to fix these things. Right. So you're constantly kind of going out of your way, being, maybe nasty towards people with cybernetic limbs because you don't believe that it's real.
Right. And as we mentioned earlier, you're playing Starship Troopers. Unlimited ammo. You don't track ammo in a Starship Troopers game. No, because part of the fun is, look at this huge gun I've got. I'm just going to blast holes and giant bugs. So why would you reinforce, reloads or, the number of shots at a clip? You wouldn't do that because it would hurt the fun of the game at one of its core concepts, right?
And I think that's another part of this that's different between a house rule versus a homebrew is those homebrew things, you're going to do things. They totally should not be a rule. If you were house ruling, you were playing, a modern military game versus the Starship Troopers one, you couldn't allow the modern military game to operate at the same level that the Starship Troopers one can, because the Starship Troopers ones are supposed to have space guns. They're supposed to have, a scope that allows them to take that fully automatic rifle and then shoot as accurately as a sniper rifle with it. They're supposed to have a gun that they can hand to an 11-year-old in the middle of a commercial and have them talk about how great the weapon is. You have to take into account some of the things where the rules you make aren't going to work everywhere. They work for that game because they're built to that game's world that you're creating. We just recently did the Mafia games I was talking about. I had an entire system built around the idea that you're a mafioso and you have this constant stream of thousands of dollars going into your hands and out of your pockets. And rather than having to track all that money, we built a mechanic around it. But that doesn't work in a fantasy game because, yes, you're getting vast hordes of treasure, but you're not spending them the way a mafioso does. No one is sitting above you going, hey, where's my cut, kid? You owe me my 25% on everything that you looted from the Dragon's Hoard because you just stabbed that guy.
Right. Exactly. So, I mean, a word of wisdom in doing I would say, let's kind of break it down to a step process. How do you homebrew something in 3 to 5 steps? I would say number 1, identify the 3 major tropes of that setting that you're trying to emulate. What are the 3 major tropes?
What's the feel that you want all the mechanics of the game to reinforce? In a zombie survival game, that feeling should be desperation. In a sci-fi game, it might be high adventure. In a Star Wars game, it might be political intrigue. Find what feel you want the mechanics to have. Because before you deal with tropes, before you deal with any of the rules changes for setting rules, you have to know what you're trying to achieve. Otherwise, you can't write rules that lead toward that.
Right. Identify the flavor of the game that you want to play, right? And then dial down to tropes. Go take a look at the tvtropes.com. It's a great resource. Just go take a look at, I'm trying to do Starship Troopers. What are some of the major themes in Starship Troopers? What are the major tropes? It's going to give them to me. The thing is not to take every trope you see and try to create a rule for it. It's listen, what are the three or what are the primary absolutely necessary trope ingredients that I want to add to this homebrew or have in this homebrew?
And then I think throw everything at the wall.
I think at that point you have to ask yourself, the Savage Worlds already do this.
Well, and that's what I'm going to get to. But before you actually ask yourself, does Savage Worlds already do this? Throw everything at the wall. Once you know the feel you're trying to achieve and the tropes you want to reinforce, sit down and just take a notepad and fill it with everything you can think of that you want this world to have. Whether it's Otuk spicy potatoes, Rastlin's, hourglass eyes, the cybernetic implant hand replacements for the mobile infantry, or the fact that in a zombie game, there's this one town that uses bullets for money. Throw all of that on your pad of paper. And then once you have this massive list of all the things that you want to do, go through and start crossing off every one of them that can be achieved with something in Savage Worlds already. Start trimming the fat, but first throw everything out there. Get it all down in front of you so you have a list to start from. No matter how stupid or bad an idea it is, it goes on the list. And then you start working from that list to find out, what does Savage Worlds already do? What do I need to write a mechanic for? What is just stupid and needs to be crossed out because it's not going to help the game at all?
Okay, and then I would say start going look at Savage Worlds. Well, what gets in the way of that? The Savage Worlds already do it. Yes. What gets in the way of me achieving these tropes or this feeling that is in Savage Worlds? Do I need to eliminate it or do I need to modify it? And then ask yourself, what's missing? And you really just need to be very, very open-minded when it comes to edges and hindrances. Don't be so literal about the labels on them. Let's take a classic example we've talked about before. Mean does not mean that you're a douchebag that goes around and picks fights with everybody. You could be Dr. House MD, where you're highly intelligent, you're a complete misanthrope and you're miserable and you have no social grace and you're just an ass. You're a self-centered ass. That's mean. You can play mean that way. Habit does not have to be a chemical dependency. You could make habit minor a quirk that is a problem for the character for your character. Certain edges don't, you can just don't get so married to the literal interpretation is what we're saying. So if there's already a hindrance there that works for it, then you're good. You're done. You don't need to worry about it. If there's a missing one, or here's where you kind of look at edges, in my opinion, or hindrances, is when you change something about the way the core rules work, you need to reevaluate the edges and hindrances. So, for example, if you put a rule in your game that all spirit rolls suffer a -1, now you got to go back and go, wait, what gives them edges already give them a bonus? Ooh, do I want that leadership edge in here to give them the +1 to negate what I just put in? You got to have to look at it like that. Like, by making these changes, what if I unbalanced and I've got it? I hate to say it, but you basically got to get a chalkboard and start balancing the equation.
Yep.
To use a physics term.
Before we went on the air tonight, I suggested a new hindrance to you for the zombie game, where you've got the character that's been educated enough on a broad enough spectrum of things that they've become dangerous because they don't actually know enough to be effective, but they know enough to try a lot of stuff. And I believe you'd floated the idea of Master of None, where basically no matter what skill level the character is at, unskilled to D12, their modifier is always a -1. So the unskilled becomes a D4 -1. They're easier unskilled checks, but to compensate, doesn't matter how skilled they become, they take a -1 on everything they do with the skill die forever, for the life of the character. It's a massive hindrance.
So it should be a major hindrance, right?
But by that token, if we take a look, the book already has a couple of hindrances that already do stuff like that, like the outsider hindrance. You can already see there's a blueprint there for a hindrance where you take penalties because of who you are, outsider. You take a -2 to all social interactions. But by the flip side, you have jack of all trades. You get this +1 to all smarts-based skills. You take those two things and you jam them together, you end up with a -1 to everything. And now you've got a character that feels unique. You've got this new hindrance that does this nifty little thing that didn't take a massive creation. It just took, well, what's this Savage Worlds rule? What's this Savage Worlds rule? And if I pour them in a beaker and swirl it around, what do I get?
Right. Well, and also too, we're getting ready to relaunch our regular Friday night game. It's Dead End again. That's why we're kind of having that conversation. It's a homebrew, so let's talk about it. One thing that I've recently added is a hindrance called straight arrow. Because it was something missing in the flavor and fabric of the game, to where you're going to be encountering other survivors all the time, and they're going to go, "Hey, you look pretty well put together. You got a community nearby?" A character should have an option not to be able to lie well, not to be horrible at it. Also,
or not to be willing to lie regardless.
Right. And they're so bad at it that anytime they tell even a white lie, like, how does this dress look? Oh, no, it looks good. They're not convincing. So, and it's a minor hindrance because it's just a -1 or -2. Now, the other thing too is there's going to be people always vying to be in charge. So I'm calling this the Shane inspired edge. And it's just an edge or a hindrance in there that I put in recently called Defiant. It means that they refuse to accept authority. They have a problem with people in authority and authority figures, anybody telling them what to do. So anytime they're in a persuasion or a social conflict with an authority figure, -2 charisma. Now, the wrinkle to that is You could say, well, that's just an interpretation of the mean hindrance or the outsider hindrance. Yes, it is, except until you add this wrinkle. They have a problem with authority. They don't get bonuses from leadership edges either when they take that hindrance because they're not listening to anything the leader is telling them. So
there's an interesting conversation we've had before where we talked about the difference between quirk and habit minor. A quirk, your character says an awful lot. Okay, it's worth a penny anytime the GM hears 3 or 4 ums in a single conversation from your character to another character in the game. But once you get to the habit minor, your character says an awful lot, and you get that -1 charisma, it's because you actually have a difficult time communicating an idea because you're constantly having to go, but there's this thing, and you've transitioned from something that is a quirk, something your character does often, to something that actually, in a mechanical way, holds the character back.
Right.
Being willing to look at those two mechanics that exist in Savage Worlds, you can create a vast array of personality type things with just those 2 hindrances. You can make the mean character with habit minor, mean, -1 to charisma, and they're always a little too aggressive.
Right.
They're always that little bit too down on everyone else around them because they're a bit too pretentious. Whatever it is, you can handle that very easily with just those 2 hindrances. And Savage Worlds has other ones that are great, but use that as your benchmark. Is this a quirk or is it a habit? You know, right. When you're creating that new thing for your game, decide, is this something that's role-play centered? Is this something that's mechanically centered? And things that have a mechanical center need to have a bite that's worth the reward that they give.
Mm-hmm.
So don't overdo the bite. Don't underdo the bite.
Well, let's rip a page out of the Sci-Fi Companion. One of the things I think is genius about the Sci-Fi Companion, you're in a high-tech society in sci-fi, all thumbs is a major hindrance, not a minor hindrance, major.
It upgrades it to a major because the setting is you're dealing with tech to do everything. By the flip side, I believe it downgrades the bad eyes hindrance to only ever being able to be taken as a minor,
right?
Because there's too many options for, you know, the LASIK and glasses and you know, there's too many optical abilities in the setting to allow you to ever take bad eyes major.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you could argue that hey, we're in a the same situation. You could say that hey, there's no such thing as permanent injury. Medical science has advanced so much, we're not even going to count permanent injury. Forget it.
All injuries can be resolved by a trip to the med bay.
Yep. Or you know, they regrow a limb. So, like we said earlier, you don't have the one arm hindrance, or you only have it for 5 days as a natural healing while they're regrowing your limb.
Yeah.
And there's something we just did, right? If you look at it, you're in a high tech setting where medical science, we can clone, we can sleeve, we can cybernetic, you can do anything. And I get my arm blown off. Okay, so you got to do the healing wound to stabilize me. But for 5 days, I'm walking around. I have to wait till my natural healing wound or roll shows up. And instead of making a healing roll, maybe I make a persuasion roll to get somebody to, you know, build me a new arm. Maybe it's a repair roll if you got cybernetic things. But you can still say it's a natural healing
purchase that takes away from the character's money pool.
Yep.
It all depends on your setting. Now, the flip side to this is, you know, well, we just talked about how there's this major change to healing. Well, what about the golden hour?
We touched on that when we talked about Star Trek, right? A few episodes back.
The golden hour is great. It's an amazing mechanic. It puts that limiter on how quickly you can get out of wounds. It makes there's a bite to having wounds that last a long time. But what if there's an edge in your setting that lets you extend to the golden hour? Or during the golden hour, I do this thing, and now the wound can be healed outside the golden hour because I slapped a trauma kit on it, or
it puts the wound in stasis.
Plastic wrap, or you're Herschel in The Walking Dead, and I chopped your freaking leg off.
Right.
I have extended the golden hour to be able to treat you later, but you ended up with a permanent injury.
Right.
You take a permanent injury now, but the actual wounds can be healed more effectively. Right. Or, we take away the whole you're going to die because you were infected aspect of that. Take a look at the game you're building. Take a look at that homebrew you're putting together and decide, hey, does this thing in Savage Worlds need to be tweaked? We've talked about, does Savage Worlds already do it? And we talked about creating the new rule, but also just stop and think about, does Savage Worlds already do something that breaks the game? Jared talked about soaking wounds for the zombie game consistently. He's always said that's something he had to take out to make it more gritty. The ability to soak wounds meant combat was something that you just went into willy-nilly, and in that game, he wanted combat to be this, oh my god, catch your breath, we just had something dangerous happen at the table. And if everybody can soak wounds and roll these massive exploding dice rolls to where, oh look, I took a shotgun to the face and I'm still standing, combat's never going to be dangerous. It's going to be Savage Worlds dangerous, but it's never going to be dangerous. So you take a look at what exists in Savage Worlds that maybe needs to be trimmed or shut off for your particular game.
Right. So a good example of that, we kind of touched on this a few weeks back. I'm not sure remember what the name of the episode was, but to do a healing roll in Savage Worlds takes 10 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, that is how many rounds? We figured out at one point, if a round is 6 seconds,
60 rounds.
That means if you bend over to apply a healing roll to a fallen compatriot, I might as well not deal you into the combat turn anymore, because you're occupied and the combat's going to end long before you get to make your healing roll.
Not just you, but you and the guy you're operating on,
right,
are out of the game for the next 10 minutes of in-game time.
Right. So now we're talking Star Trek. Let's fast forward and say, hey, I'm going to do this ingenious Star Trek homebrew. Well, the first thing I want to look at is, okay, how long does it take to make a healing roll? 1 round. Done.
Yeah, the eyeball sprays, the tricorder.
Yep. So, how does the tricorder work mechanically? It's just because it adds +2 to notice or +2 to any skill that you're about to do by using the tricorder. Or maybe the tricorder, when you're trying to scan for life forms, gives you notice as a farsight power and extends your range. It's finding what already works in Savage Worlds and just, nope, this is that, this is this, and adapting it or tweaking it.
So Sunset Sam asked a question. Are there 2 types of homebrews? Those using standard rules but your own universe setting, and those that create, patch together new or setting rules to go with an existing property trope?
Yes. I think both kind of exist. You could do either or.
I would say when you start getting into your universe using core Savage Worlds, it's almost not a homebrew at that point. If your universe, if your world doesn't require Savage Worlds to change at all, it basically means you're running the real world. Savage Worlds is kind of written to exist in maybe a more cinematic version of the real world, a movie version of the real world. But you're saying your game exists in that continuity, that level of combat, that level of swingy nature, all the consistent things about the core rules. You're saying none of that's different in your world. Therefore, your world becomes trappings. It's not a homebrew. At the other end of the spectrum, where you're patching together a bunch of stuff, that's where you've had to tweak the rules, because Core Savage Worlds is great, but Core Savage Worlds requires trappings for anything you're going to do with it. But you've even gone so far as to say, yeah, Core Savage Worlds is great, but this part needs to bend. Now it fits what I'm trying to do with it.
Right. Yeah, I think you run the danger of too much patchwork if you allow too much patchworking from other settings to take place too.
I've said it before. My favorite quote from Sean Patrick Fannin was that when he went back to redo Shaintar, he realized the more he changed, the more he made it, the more he added, the less it was Savage Worlds, and it kind of got worse. That he ended up finding he was trimming things from the original Shaintar to get to the redone version, because he didn't need those extra rules. He didn't need that extra stuff. And I think that's one of those great things about Savage Worlds. As you get to know the system more and more and more, you find out how little you actually need, other than a nice set of trappings, a nice set of set dressing, and then some tweaks here or there, just to fine-tune, dial the knobs in.
Yeah, it's like the Wizard of Oz. The more you play it, the more you realize it's just a man behind the curtain. Running, pulling levers. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. It runs very smoothly, very simply, but it's not obvious. Oh, wait, I'm looking at Deadlands Noir. Oh, check out these incredible interrogation rules. And then somebody who's played Savage Worlds for a while will come in and go, that's just a social conflict rule that allows you to use persuasion and interrogation. It's a genius implementation, don't get me wrong, but it's not a brand new rule. It's not something that never existed in Savage Worlds. It's somebody who's familiar with the system going, let me kind of specialize this for our game system, because that's a big part of Noir. It's like getting somebody and interrogating them, finding out, who do you work for?
Well, there for a long time, there were a lot of arguments in the community that, you couldn't run an intrigue game in Savage Worlds, or you couldn't run this or that in Savage Worlds, right. That, the combat is too swingy. All of those people have failed to see that Savage Worlds is designed to be a framework and tweaked. Mm-hmm. And while, yes, we beat the drum around here all the time, play it rules as written, that's when you're learning the game. When the training wheels come off, you're supposed to tweak it. You're not supposed to run it at factory settings anymore. Right. Once you're out of the training period, Savage Worlds is designed from the very base concept to be tweaked. I guarantee you cannot find a Savage setting put out by Pinnacle that doesn't have setting rules. Every single one of them have new edges, new hindrances, and setting rules. Even PEG doesn't release settings that don't change how the rules work.
Right.
If they don't do it, don't expect to do it at your table.
And if you take a look, at Deluxe or any of them, that's why they give you, hey, here's some starter setting rules. Here's things that break the game. Now, the other thing too is don't bring in assumptions from other games when you're dealing with Savage Worlds. One of the things we've talked about repeatedly, and it bears repeating again, a critical failure in Savage Worlds doesn't mean something horrible happens. Nowhere in the rule book does it say when you roll double ones, oh, you're screwed. Nowhere in the rule set does it say that. The only thing it says is you can't re-roll. And that's if you have the critical failure setting rule in place.
The critical failure setting rule says you can't re-roll if you roll double ones.
Right. That's what I just said, right?
The M section of the book says something bad happens, but it doesn't say it must be the worst thing that happens. And that's where that thing gets twisted. Is the GM section absolutely does say you rolled double ones, come up with the bad thing that happened. Something went wrong. What was it? It doesn't say shatter the player's magic longsword because they happen to roll a 1 on their attack roll. the way some other games do.
Right. So, bennies are not hit points. There's other things we can say about that, but I'm just trying to think real quick, just giving a quick overview as far as creating a homebrew. We're talking about setting rules. The main thing is not to try to do a 1-for-1 conversion of your favorite role-playing game. That is
go play the other game. I don't care if it's BattleTech. I don't care if it's D&D. I don't care if it's Shadowrun. If you find yourself drawn into I have to make a rule because there's a rule in that, then go play that, because that's really what you want to do at the end of the day.
Right.
You want a rule for everything that it has rules for, then go play its rules and just house rule the stuff there that doesn't work. Go play D&D, but add bennies.
Right.
Because that's a house rule that you've made, something that you enjoyed from Savage Worlds that you're going to bring into your D&D game, rather than trying to bring all of your D&D game into Savage Worlds just to get bennies.
Well, and this too, it just take a look at the rules that are in Savage Worlds and make the decision. I mean, I see this a lot. Especially with people trying to talk about doing a Star Trek conversion, or people talking about doing pirates as a homebrew. You will hear this same question over and over. How do you handle ship-to-ship combat? By the rules in Savage Worlds. If you want to run it more cinematic, it's use the chase rules as a combat. If you want to run it more tactical, there's vehicular combat rules. All the stats are there. I don't understand the question. You don't need special
more when people have that question regarding things like a starfighter or a World War II airplane combat thing where every player character is in their own vehicle. Mm-hmm. I completely get it then when someone's like, how do I run a dogfight in Savage Worlds that's not a clusterfuck? I get it. I've seen it. I understand. I don't think anyone has the perfect storm answer for that one yet. I think even Peg has struggled with that. That's why you'll get, Uncle Clint goes, run it as a chase, because even he doesn't have a great answer for you in this particular case. But if all the players are in one spot, all players are on the Enterprise, why do you need to track where every other ship is? Why not just track where everyone on the bridge is? There's outgoing fire that hits that other ship. You don't need to know where all those other ships are or how fast they're moving. You just need to know where all the bridge personnel are and how fast they're moving.
Right. Well, and okay, so let's talk about this too. Well, you have to kind of take a step back and ask yourself, wait a minute, what's the point of a battle in a starship? Let's take Star Wars. Let's take Star Wars, Star Trek, and just for shits and giggles, Pirates of the Spanish Main, an RPG, right? And ask, or even a pirate, maybe like Pirates of the Caribbean. What is the purpose of ship-to-ship combats when you see those scenes? In Star Wars, it's all about the rule of cool. Watch this shit happen while lasers are going everywhere. It's a visual feeding frenzy. It's meant to go, woohoo, this is exciting.
Which is why there are ships in every Star Wars movie that serve no practical military purpose. And even Disney and LucasArts have come out and said, yes, we just put them in there so there's something on the screen for you to look at.
Right.
Because there's a big debate out there regarding why these ships are there. And people are like, but no, this is listed as this kind of ship and it has no guns. Why would they take it to a star battle? Because it looks cool on the screen, folks.
It's rule of cool. That thing moves really quick, and I can slide in and get a shot. It's all about the rule of cool. Hey, check out how cool this is. Watch all these ships do amazing things because it's fun and cool. Now, you look at Star Trek. What is the point of a starship battle in Star Trek? It's to increase tension and drama.
It's to ratchet up the drama.
That's it. That's it.
Every time a Klingon vessel goes into cloak, it's because all of a sudden you're going to require is someone to make a dice roll. If it's on the bridge crew, to find the cloaked ship using sensors, and you're going to give them a great moment to vomit gobbledygook onto the play table of all the scientific terms they can think of for how they found it. And you're going to give them a Benny for being great with Star Trek vernacular and gobbledygook.
Yeah, of course. And then let's look at a pirate movie. What's the point of a ship-to-ship battle in a pirate movie? It's about high adventure. It's to give the characters a reason to like swing from the scaffold and swashbuckle and fire cannons that look cool, or be boarded or not be boarded. It's not about sinking the ship necessarily. It's not about damaging the vehicle. It's not about respective size or tactical advantage.
Pirates don't want to sink the other ship. It's got to still be floating for them to carry the cargo off of it and get paid.
Right. So in a pirate, it's about high adventure. In Star Wars, it's about the rule of cool. In Star Trek, it's about ratcheting up drama. Nowhere in there do I care about tactical movement. So if I'm writing a Star Trek game, why do I care about forward-facing shields, not facing shields, phaser arcs? Why do I care?
Take your head out of being a gamer and remember you're playing a role-playing game. Right. In what way does this thing impact the individual characters you're talking about, narratively and mechanically? It doesn't matter where the shields are on the Enterprise. What matters is when the ship got hit, did the player characters feel a rock because the inertial dampeners went off and the whole bridge shook and they have to make a roll to stay on their feet? It doesn't matter how much damage it did to the ship. You're going to handle that narratively when you say, and the ship is going down, and everyone has to make their dice roll to run to an escape pod.
Right.
Those things don't matter. What matters is what do their characters deal with as part of that scene. Let your tactical battles of that scale feed the description of what your players are seeing. Think of the Lord of the Rings, the Battle of Helm's Deep. We don't care how many orcs are standing in the valley in front of Helm's Deep, being shot at by all of the elves that came from Rivendell or Lothlorien are standing on the wall firing their bow. What we care about are the 12 orcs that are standing directly on the bridge that Gimli and Aragorn are actually making dice rolls to fight against. The other 30,000 orcs don't matter. Their backdrop, their set dressing to the 12 orcs that do matter.
Right. And if you want to run a battle of that nature in your game that's Helm's Deep proportions, Savage Worlds has a thing called Mass Combat or Mass Battles that'll handle that perfectly. Just like Dave described. You're you're very abstracting the two sides of that army and figuring things out, but the individual player characters are doing their own thing and they're making headway in that battle as well. So at the end of the day, when you're going to do a homebrew, you have to ask yourself, if I'm going to put this in my game, why is it there? What's the purpose of this thing that I'm in love with about Star Trek that is in this game? Now, is that to say that you can't play a very highly tactical miniatures game with Star Trek? Absolutely not. You absolutely can. But that's not the role-playing game. That's not the narrative story. That is its own tactical adventure game. And even FASA understood that back in the 80s because they didn't release it as part of the regular role-playing game rules.
Savage Worlds has rules for that called skirmish rules that handle tactical, on-the-table, big battles really well. But again, in those skirmish rules, you're worried about the ship. You're not worried about the officer on the bridge of this ship and the story around his character. Right. It's that game is centered on the tactical battle. Right. Mel Primus said something in chat that I think fits here. And he said, don't try to bring Vancian magic into Savage Worlds, just play Pathfinder or D&D. And he's wrong. Don't try to make Savage Worlds power system work like D&D's magic system. Go play D&D if you want to play that mechanic. If you want Vancy and magic, and we've talked about it on this show, Richard Woolcock has an entire Bible out there for how to do it. There are ways to do Vancy and magic in Savage Worlds. You can do that just fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Don't try to do D&D in Savage Worlds. You can do a D&D adventure in Savage Worlds, but don't try to play D&D by playing Savage Worlds.
Right.
Don't try to play BattleTech or the old Star Trek fleet battles in Savage Worlds. Play Savage Worlds in Savage Worlds.
Yeah, well, and also too, there's nothing wrong with having a tactical battle in your game. The problem is that, like you said, too many people get married to this was a great thing about this game. Let me go ahead and bring it over here. No, look at what's already here that handles that, and then decide how important is it.
Well, there's another great example in it that I've seen. Wizards of the Coast, right around the time that they released 4th edition D&D, released this box set that was called 3 Dragon Ante. And it was basically a poker game entirely centered on the D&D tropes. It had all the dragons from D&D. It had all the new races and everything they introduced with 4th edition. It was this great little tie-in, Chotsky-sized box you could buy, full of cards that you lay down on your table and play a little poker game with your friends. And in it, it had a little, 3x5 little rules book that told you how to play this card game. And the back 2 pages of it was dedicated how to use this with your existing D&D game. And the crux of that rule was throw out the gambling rules from D&D, stop your D&D game, play a couple games of 3 Dragon Ante, whoever won, translate that back to your D&D game, and then continue on.
Yep.
They didn't need special rules for D&D. They just said, okay, play this game and have that have an impact on the other game. So At the end of the day, if you want to have a big tactical battle for your Starfleet battle or your naval battle that's going to happen in your pirate game, there's a lot of different ways to do that. There's a lot of great games out there that'll allow you to do it. Go play those for an afternoon. And whatever the results of those are, feed that back into your Savage Worlds role-playing game and tell the story about how that battle affected the characters.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, this hobby of ours isn't about gaming. It's about role-playing, telling stories around characters. If what you're doing in your game doesn't involve that, then take a step back and figure out what's the best way to handle this for the game and move forward. The reason Mass Battles is so abstract and people have so much trouble with it is Shane and Clint and the folks at PEG created a system that says, okay, at a high level, how can we get this over with in 5 or 6 dice rolls so that it doesn't bog down the storytelling RPG that we're trying to do? There's a reason it's not this massive, this block of units moves to here, and this block of units moves to here, and this guy gets a flank maneuver or a pincer. Those are all great things if you're a tabletop war gamer and know what a pincer maneuver is, or know what flanking's all about, or running them down after you've broken their morale. But those rules don't exist in Mass Battles and Savage Worlds because those are rules that are battlefield rules.
Yeah.
And we're talking about individual personal rules.
Right. And let's talk about this for a second, too. Do I want to run a simulation in my game? Do I want to do that? It's not. Is that why I'm playing the game?
Verisimilitude creeping up on us here.
Yeah, it becomes a point of verisimilitude, and I think a lot of people, a lot of savages, myself included, when we first look at the chase rules, are approaching it from a tactical mindset, looking at it, going, a bunch of shit. How can I be long range 1 round and then short range then what? No, this is horrible. Oh, Mass Battles. Why would I ever play? Because the point is, like Dave said, to abstract it. It doesn't matter because it doesn't involve your main character. If okay, if I'm playing, for example, let's just take it a great example. If I'm playing The Matrix and I'm running the highway scene from Reloaded, am I tracking? Do I want to track 1,500 vehicles on that freeway moving at different speeds with different drivers? No, because in the real world, it's not real. Number one, it's not real. So automatically, Trinity can do incredible things on that motorcycle. Characters can fight on the top of moving semi-trucks because in the Matrix, they can bend gravity in reality. So why would I want a verisimilitude, exact tactical, real-world approach to something that is happening in the Matrix to begin with? I don't want that. I want quick, high action, high adventure. Let's get to the monkey and get this over with, but let's do this in a way that's highly abstracted and serves the story, doesn't serve reality or the laws of physics. That's why mass battles exist. That's why chase rules exist. And when you kind of embrace that concept and that approach, your chases can be narratively exciting and still make mechanical sense in terms of the game. But this is not intended to be a podcast about chase rules. One thing you may do too, for example, the new shaken rules. If they don't work for your game, write a setting rule and go, hey, nope, the old shaken rules apply. Or even the shaken rules from the Explorers Edition apply, or even the shaken rules from the original core rules apply. If you don't like the current version of chases, check out the chases from Explorer. Those might serve your game and your playstyle at your table better for the homebrew that you're putting together and that already exists. It's just slide it right in from a previous version of Savage Worlds. So, with that said, unless we have anything else in the live chat.
Nope.
All right. The Flash Gordon, we'd be remiss not to mention the Flash Gordon Kickstarter is still running, even though it funded in an hour?
Under an hour. I would be shocked if any of the people who are watching this or hearing it later on haven't funded it, haven't gone in and pledged to it. It's kind of, it's the flagship property that Peg's been after basically since the beginning of the Savage World. So,
right. And hey, what's good for Peg is good for us and good for you and good for Savage World. So support it. Until next time, this is Jared Savage Daddy Gunning for Dave and Jib, who dropped off early, saying keep rolling and stay savage.